You remember the smell of honey before you even had language. Sweetness came before truth. A soft hand reached for your face, and you believed it was love, not knowing it was only instinct, only power veiled in tenderness. You've never questioned why the lullaby always sounded like a warning, why the smile made you feel owned, not safe. You've called it care, but it was hunger, not yours, hers. You've seen her eyes shimmer when she cries, but you never asked why the tears seemed rehearsed. You felt guilt without crime, desire without direction, and every time you disobeyed, her silence became your punishment. You thought you failed her, but the game was never yours to win. There is something unbearable behind her softness, a demand hidden in every compliment, a trap hidden in every caress. You feel it when she calls you good. You feel it when she needs your strength but feeds on your weakness. You feel it now. You think she loves you, but what if that love was never yours? What if it was only the theater of her need? You remember the first time you felt warmth, and it was not from fire. It came from her eyes, heavy with expectation before you could even speak. You mistook her need for your presence as love, not yet knowing that she had already named you before you named yourself. Her arms wrapped around you like safety, but they were measuring you, molding you, bending you toward a shape you didn't choose. You learned early that to be seen was to be devoured slowly with praise, with softness, with sacrifice disguised as affection. You were not raised, you were cultivated. She taught you obedience not through command, but through longing. Every time you pleased her, you felt the illusion of peace, not your peace hers. She smiled, and you melted. But that smile was currency, and you kept chasing it like a dying man chases mirages. You wanted to be good because her eyes made you feel that goodness was the only way to survive her. You were her mirror, not her son, not her lover, not her protector, though she whispered all three when she thought you weren't listening. You confused closeness with fusion, and fusion with love, but you were only being pulled under, like a swimmer too small for the tide. The sweetness she gave you had a shape round, warm, maternal, but you never noticed the teeth behind it. She didn't bite, she didn't scream, she dissolved you, with lullabies that taught you how to feel, with gazes that punished before words arrived, with subtle shifts in her voice that marked your guilt before your actions ever took form. You couldn't tell where you ended and she began, and that was the point. She wore no armor because her battlefield was your soul. She didn't raise a boy, she planted a wound that would seek her forever. Every time you reached for her approval, you were practicing surrender. Not surrender to love, but to dependency. You were being taught that to be loved is to be pleasing is to obey, and to obey is to disappear. She never told you to vanish, but you did. In every apology you whispered for emotions you didn't understand. In every moment you held back truth to keep the sweetness flowing. In every silent vow you made to never be the kind of man who scares her. And so you became the kind of man who scared yourself. She dressed your weakness in virtue. She called your passivity kindness, your submission sensitivity, your compliance respect. But beneath her praise, she was clipping your wings. She feared your strength even as she claimed to nurture it. When your voice deepened, she looked away. When your desires emerged, she redefined them as threats. And when you began to pull away, as all growing men must, she reminded you of your debt. Not with violence, but with withdrawal. Not with punishment, but with tears. And so, you stayed. There is no war more invisible than the one inside a boy who was taught to love the woman who feeds on his softness. She never told you she needed you to protect her. She only hinted. She only sighed. She only left pauses long enough for guilt to crawl in. And when you tried to become your own, not hers, she whispered that you were cruel, cold, lost. So you returned, ashamed of your autonomy, and called it love again. But it wasn't love, it was training. She doesn't love you for who you are. She loves the parts of you that still belong to her. The boy who listens, the boy who comforts, the boy who doesn't make her feel abandoned like the man before him did. She never told you about that man, but you saw his shadow in her silence. You saw him every time she looked through you, not at you. You saw him when her touch lingered too long, when her joy rose from your sorrow, when her pride rested not on your truth, but on your usefulness. You were her redemption, her second chance, and so you were never free. You still feel her in your choices, in the women you choose who smile like her, who wound like her, who vanish the moment you show your teeth. You call it attraction, you call it chemistry, but it is only memory deep, unspoken, cellular. You chase what you were trained to please, and what pleases her is a man who remains a boy in disguise, a boy who still whispers, "Am I good?" long after her voice is gone. She was your first addiction, not because she gave you too little, but because she gave you sweetness laced with silence, praise wrapped in judgment, affection that demanded your absence. And now you walk through the world carrying the blueprint she carved into your spine. You believe your softness is virtue, but it is only fear dressed in her perfume. You don't rage against her. You can't. She didn't harm you in the way the world respects. No bruises, no slaps. Only a slow rearranging of your instincts, until you couldn't tell the difference between giving and disappearing. You want to forgive her, but that would mean admitting what was done. And to admit that is to burn the temple where you first learned to kneel. You remember her smile, but you do not remember your own. She built you inside her gaze, and you mistook that gaze for identity. You became the man who makes women feel safe. Not because they are safe, but because you are no longer real. You've softened your edges to fit inside the shape she carved for you. You've mistaken absence for gentleness. And now, when real desire calls, you are mute. She did not raise a son. She grew a witness to her pain, to her sacrifice, to the echo of her own unmet hunger. And you, in your need to please, became the place where her hunger lives on. You feed it still, in your guilt, in your patience, in your shame. You call it love, but it is only survival learned at her breast, whispered through her breath, sealed in the velvet mask she wore every time she smiled too long. And still, you miss her, not the woman, but the sweetness, the lie, the feeling of being needed so completely that you never had to become real. That was her gift, that was her wound, and now it is yours. You never noticed how her laughter hid something until you heard it in the wrong moment. It wasn't joy, it wasn't innocence, it was something older, sharper, like the sound a lock makes when it clicks behind you. You had thought her humor was light, but it was always a veil, a door. When she laughed, it meant you had entered a space you didn't understand. You were no longer a boy, you were becoming a man, and she could feel it. That's when the smile changed. It became approval mixed with restraint, fascination tangled with fear. She loved your innocence because it meant control. But now, with your eyes darker and your silence deeper, you were no longer safe for her to own. You began to notice how she played, not with toys or games, but with moods, absences, hints. One day, she praised you for your tenderness. The next, she vanished behind coldness without explanation. You asked what was wrong, and she said nothing, but her body became a wall. You apologized, unsure for what. That was the game. She trained you to read every gesture as a code, every silence as your fault. She laughed when you misread, not because it was funny, but because it meant you were still dancing inside her script. And every time you sought clarity, She rewarded you with more mystery. She knew confusion makes you loyal, certainty gives you wings, and she wasn't ready to let you fly. Her sweetness became punishment once you stopped needing it. The moment you stopped asking, stopped pleasing, stopped performing. She introduced a different face, colder, but no less controlled. She withheld not to wound you directly, but to let you bleed yourself. You gave more, hoping she would return. You blamed yourself, thinking you had become unworthy. But it was never about worth. It was about distance. The moment you began to step outside the design, she needed to reel you back in. She did it with softness. She did it with laughter. She did it with hints of affection so brief, so potent. You doubted your own hunger. There are rooms inside her that you were never allowed to see, and her laughter guards them. It tells you don't ask. It mocks your courage when you try. Every time you approach, she distracts you with flattery. She tells you how rare you are, how sensitive, how special, and you forget. You forget the questions you wanted to ask. You forget the discomfort. You bask in being seen, not realizing that what she sees is only what she shaped. She doesn't want you to explore her. She wants you to orbit her, and you obeyed, because her approval felt like sunlight in winter, brief, unreliable, but intoxicating. She didn't demand. She teased. She suggested, and then withdrew. The moment you became too sure of yourself, she reminded you, in that invisible way, that her affection was conditional, not out loud, never out loud, but you felt it in your chest, in that old familiar knot, be smaller, or she will vanish. That knot has followed you into every room since. You've seen her do it to others, too. A glance, a compliment, a sudden closeness, then distance. She plants the seed of longing and disappears. Her power is not in love. It is in the choreography of access. She opens the door just wide enough for you to believe you're welcome, and then click. She laughs. She says, "You think too much." She says, "You're too serious." But you know that behind her laughter is knowledge, ancient, intimate knowledge, the knowledge of how to manipulate desire without ever touching it. She never needed to seduce. She only needed to create the illusion that you were almost enough, almost chosen, almost hers, and that almost became the leash. You chased not her body, not even her heart, but the fantasy of being the one who could enter the forbidden room. She made sure the lock was inside you. She didn't have to say no. You said it to yourself. Every time you doubted your instincts, every time you silenced your anger, every time you bowed before her vulnerability. But her vulnerability was not weakness. It was theater. The more fragile she seemed, the more guilty you felt for wanting something beyond her script. Her tears were rehearsed, not faked, no. She cried real tears, but she knew when to summon them. And when you softened in response, she drew you back into her orbit. Her pain became your burden. Her needs became your compass. And you forgot again that you had a direction of your own. It is not cruelty, it is hunger, a hunger masked in the sacred. She doesn't think she is using you. She thinks she is surviving. Every gesture, every softness, every ache she displays is a test. Will you serve or separate? Most serve, most fall into the old story, the myth of the sweet woman who just wants to be loved. But sweetness can be a cage, and love, when shaped by fear, becomes submission. You wanted to protect her. That was your first mistake. She doesn't need protection. She needs witnesses, worshippers, mirrors. And when you become too real, too autonomous, too present, you threaten the myth. So she retreats. She blames. She questions your love. And you, like a trained dog, return. You sniff the air for signs of her approval. You wag your tail. You lower your eyes. You forget that you were born with teeth. She has no interest in who you really are, only in who you are willing to become for her. If you obey, she smiles. If you rebel, she pouts. And you, afraid of losing the one who once cradled your pain, choose to shrink, to dim, to bend. You abandon truth for closeness. But closeness is not intimacy. It is only the illusion of safety. You learn to feel safe when you're needed, not when you're known. She taught you that. She rewarded your silence with warmth. She punished your truth with distance. And now, every time a woman laughs at your seriousness, every time she praises your sensitivity, then disappears, you are back in the room, the forbidden room, the room of her laughter, the room where love always costs your voice. You thought you were becoming a man, but you were only rehearsing a role, the man who stays soft enough to never threaten her fragility, the man who reads her moods like scripture, the man who apologizes for wanting more, the man who trades his edge for her comfort. That man is everywhere now, in offices, in bedrooms, in poems about empathy and restraint. But he is not free. He is performing. He is still waiting for the door to open. And the laughter echoes. It always does. Because she never needed to break you. She only needed to make you believe you were one wrong word away from being unloved. She doesn't need to control you. She only needs to remind you of what you'd lose, and you lose. Every time you don't speak, every time you nod, every time you smile back, every time you laugh with her. Not because it's funny, but because you're afraid of what silence would expose. You do not remember the first time she wounded you, because it was not a wound made with violence. It was soft, slow, wrapped in sweetness, like a thorn hidden in silk. It happened when she looked at you not as her son, not even as a child, but as something that should understand her, that should complete her, that should become what the man before her never was. And in that moment, you ceased being real. You became a projection, a balm, an extension of someone else's unfinished pain, a child expected to soothe adult hunger, a boy expected to carry the weight of a story he never wrote. You called it love. You still do. Because it came with gentle hands and a voice that trembled just enough to make you afraid of causing more damage. Her damage, not yours. You became careful around her. You monitored yourself. You worried about how your words might sound. You learned to read her face before you learned to read books. And slowly, you absorbed the unspoken rule: if she breaks, it's your fault. So you guarded her against your anger, against your desire, against your growing voice. That is how the wound was planted, not through rejection, but through dependence. She needed you to be soft because your strength reminded her of someone who had left her, or betrayed her, or desired her without staying. So when your voice grew firmer, she pulled away. When your thoughts wandered toward freedom, she gave you silence. And when you returned to her afraid, uncertain, guilty, she praised you. You're not like other men, she said, and you mistook that praise for love. But it was only a leash. She made you believe that being different meant being better, but in truth, it only meant being safer for her. You became the man who listens, the man who comforts, the man who never pushes, never violates, never threatens, but also the man who never dares, never leads, never claims. You disowned your power to remain loved, and the wound grew deeper, not because she hated you, but because she needed you small, and needing someone to be small is a form of consumption. You think you became kind by nature, But your kindness was carved out of fear, fear of abandonment, fear of her sadness, fear that if you ever became fully male with your shadow, your lust, your intensity, you would lose her. So you buried those parts. You learned to smile through discomfort, to nod when you disagreed, to feel guilt in moments of pleasure. You thought you were virtuous, but you were only obedient. And now, that obedience follows you into the arms of women who reflect her, women who praise your softness but do not respect your boundaries, women who ask for safety and respond to chaos, women who pull you close and then retreat the moment you ask for something real. You choose them without knowing why, but you are only trying to resolve the first wound, the wound of being made responsible for someone else's emotions. You still believe that if you are gentle enough, careful enough, pleasing enough, you will finally be loved without conditions. But that is a lie planted long ago by her, and it grows in every woman you let replace her. The wound is not in your body, it is in your script, in the way you hesitate before speaking, in the way you smile when you're hurt, in the way you downplay your hunger, your drive, your need for solitude, conquest, direction. You were not taught how to lead. You were taught how to avoid rejection. And now, your masculinity has become a performance of restraint. You call it wisdom. You call it maturity. But it is still fear, carefully curated to appear acceptable. She told you that you were enough, but only when you behaved, when you were quiet, when you noticed her needs before your own, when you anticipated her moods like a servant awaiting orders. You believed it made you special, but special was just another word for useful. You were rewarded for suppressing the very parts of you that were meant to grow wild. You remember the first time a woman said you were safe, and it thrilled you. It meant you were winning. You were not like the others. But then she left, or cheated, or grew bored, and you were confused. You had followed all the rules. You had offered your best self, the gentle self, the healing self. But you didn't see that what she truly wanted was the part you buried, the part you were punished for showing, the part she still fears because it makes you real. Your masculinity is not the enemy. Your desire is not a threat. Your rage is not shameful, but she made you believe all of it had to be contained. So now, you live in containment, a man in a glass box, admired for being thoughtful, discarded for being unmemorable. Women say they want kindness, but what they crave secretly, silently, is the man who owns his center, who does not apologize for his presence, who does not fold to earn affection, who does not fear rejection more than truth. You were made to fear being too much, but you should have feared being forgotten, because that is what happens to men who try to be palatable. They are praised and then erased. You are not remembered for the feelings you protected, but for the truths you dared to express. And she, the first woman, the silent sculptor, trained you never to dare. So now, you live with fragments, half yeses, muted instincts. You look in the mirror and wonder why you feel hollow after being loved. But it is not love you receive. It is approval, temporary, conditional, fleeting, like hers. Always just enough to keep you returning. Never enough to set you free. You think you're healed because you don't hate her, but healing isn't about forgiveness. It's about seeing, and you still don't see what was done, because it wasn't loud, it wasn't brutal, it was quiet, elegant, laced with perfume and lullabies. She was not a monster, she was a teacher, and what she taught you was this: to be loved. You must not disturb, but real men disturb, not out of cruelty, out of presence. They take up space, they speak their hunger, they risk being alone rather than diluted. And the boy she raised, the boy you still carry, was not built for that. He was built to be received, not to reach, to support, not to strike, to ache, not to act. So you sit with women who say they want depth, but when you offer it, they vanish, because your depth is still wrapped in apology, still waiting for permission, still unsure whether being seen is the same as being accepted. It's not. She taught you to perform intimacy, not to live it, and that performance is breaking you. You were not made to be neutral. You were made to burn, to carry weight, to hold a woman without disappearing inside her storm. But first, you must see the origin, the first wound, the first script, the velvet smile that taught you to betray yourself in exchange for her comfort. She did not mean to harm you, but harm does not need intent. It only needs repetition, and her pattern lives in you still, until you choose otherwise, until you stop performing, until you speak even if she leaves, even if all of them leave. And they might, but at last, you will remain. She is no longer in the room, but the mirror still tilts toward her. You sit in silence, but her breath lingers in your restraint. You've walked through 100 doors thinking they were yours, but each was carved in the shape of her approval. You reach for love and find a question. You speak, and your voice still waits for her reaction. Outside, the world stirs with women who smile like she did. Inside, the boy still listens for footsteps that no longer come. The wound no longer bleeds, but it blooms. Quietly, recursively, beautifully, and somewhere beneath your ribs, a door remains closed. You have the key, but your hand still trembles, not from fear, but from memory. What will you become once her name no longer shapes your silence?